historically, a lot of filmmakers have tried to choose an aesthetic that can promote social change. So people like Eisenstein or writers like Upton St. Clair have used realism, for example. Brecht was very concerned about how theater can be used as a way to encourage critical thinking. So can you tell us how your style, your aesthetic has changed over time and what you think is most effective in terms of achieving social change through film, and with the example of your current film? How have you used?
Well, this is a big question, really. I think in a way you can construct a theory, but then there's a point when your instinct comes into play, and your gut feeling about just responding to images, responding to the people you see on film. And when I was a student, we did a lot of Brecht, and I still like his writings very much. But I feel that at times he got into a little bit of a fetish, really. Not Brecht's fault, but the people who were doing it. And I always find that I respond to recognizing people, recognizing their dilemmas, having a solidarity with the characters on the film, feeling like that's me, and that's me in that character, that's me in that character, and that's it's not a kind of immobilizing empathy. It's a feeling of solidarity with people, or understanding with people, sharing their experiences. And then if you see a story in which you have a sense of where you might be in it, then just seeing it told gives you an objective perspective on it, so that you can then evaluate it. If it happens in your own life, everything is too neat. You have no perspective. If you see it in a narrative, in a story, then it's more easy to have a perspective. So I think that's part of our aesthetic. It's a very particular cinematic aesthetic, which I could talk about, but maybe this isn't the time to speak at length about lenses and lighting and camera positions. But it's very practical. It comes down, to the nuts and bolts of filmmaking. But I think also it's in the stories you choose to tell. We always find it very important to tell stories of working class people, because their stories aren't told, A. B, because their use of language is more vivid. C, because they live their lives with much greater stake, and much greater things at stake. And D, and most important of all, because if things are going to change, that's where it's going to come from. So those are the reasons to pick working class stories. Because in the end, it's an old-fashioned view, I know. In the end, that's where strength lies. That's where I think where strength lies. So that's why they tell the best jokes. So that's why we would use that as a social location.
Do you want to let your journey? Yes.
I've always thought that in your films you've been able to sum up really difficult ideas in a very quick way, like in The Wind That Shakes the Barley. In a couple of scenes you illustrated really well the difference between somebody who just supported the Republic and somebody who supported the IRA, or in Rude Irish, with very few words from the musician, he summed up the Iraqi view so well. Are those scenes really difficult to write? And you spend a lot of time having to come up with them?
Well, I suppose I've had a great apprenticeship with Ken and Rebecca over the years. We've made lots of films together. And I suppose you realise very, very quickly that you've only got a maximum 2 hours roughly to try and tell a story. So there has to be some sense of tremendous economy. You have to find a premise, and you have to find characters who hopefully will lead us to the story we want to tell. So it's an endless and tricky task to try and tell the story efficiently and visually, or whatever way you can lead to those ideas. And hopefully some sense that the story is there, but underneath there's a big shadow, and you imply things rather than spelling things out, because there's a great difference between telling a story and having a you know, a political platform or a documentary, we have to try and find the characters so that everything that unravels is truthful to their point of view.
But I mean, just that, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, this is, and I hate it where people sit and scratch each other's backs, but I mean, it is crystallizing it, as you say, you know, is not, I mean, that's the writer's art, really, and crystallizing those complex ideas so that you get the essence of the conflict, and they're expressed in a way that is truthful to the person speaking. It isn't from a textbook. I mean, that's the hardest thing of all. And oddly enough, and this is very interesting, oddly enough, when you get reviews, they just don't deal with that at all. They just don't deal with it. I mean, imagine you write a book, you know, you could mention the stuff in the Irish film. Imagine you write a book about the War of Independence and the Civil War and the ideas that they were fighting over and the role of the British. And they just talk about, you know, the use of the semicolon. I mean, that's the level it's at. And when you do a film, they just don't deal with the Brits, in that case, the British presence in Ireland, the role of the British state in dividing the Republican movement, backing the Republican side that they could do deals with because they wouldn't challenge their dominance in the Irish economy, and so on. You know, big ideas, the end of an imperialist experiment, but well, not experiment, went on very long, but the end of an imperialist period, but nevertheless they held on to a bit. You know, all that which Paul just knitted into the fabric of the film, never mentioned, and it is extraordinary. But I mean, your point is absolutely a good one.
Ken, Paul, and Rebecca, you guys have been making films for a while, and you're very conscious of the social, political environment in which you make your films. What's your sense today, in our particular, let's call it, historic moment, right? We've got a major economic crisis, we've got a climate crisis, we've got, who knows, possible nuclear war in Iran. But in making films within that context, where do you see things going? Do you have a sense of you know, your filmmaking project, or generally how these events are going to impact the filmmaking?
Well, do you mean in terms of how we actually make the films, or how that atmosphere and those issues affect the subject matters we choose? I'm just
both.
Well, I mean, I suppose that's always a dialogue we're having between the three of us all the time. You know, when it takes so long to actually get a film made, the time you start from the very beginning, you choose it, you think it, research it, you write the script and you keep tugging away at it, and then the time you make and get it out, I mean, it's generally quite a long time. So we're always asking ourselves the toughest question, right? What is the next best project to do among all these wonderful things? But you can't just do a script to order, like I think you said previously. You know, just because there's a good issue doesn't mean we'll find a good story. We have to find a human way into it, and something that's original, hasn't been done before, that excites us, that, and as Ken said previously, you actually feel you're going on a journey with the project and finding something out. Like I remember when we did the, you know, It's a Free World, it really was digging underneath the Anglo-Saxon miracle. And it's amazing even how times have changed since then. When we made that film, the Anglo-Saxon miracle was preached as if it was wonderful. Everybody had to follow the Anglo-Saxon model. If only Europe did that, they would be much better off. And you know, suddenly things change, things fall apart. And it is quite remarkable to see how quickly things can change. And I think you're right too, there is a great sense of crisis now. You know, everything looks much more fragile. The economy looks much more fragile. And I think that's been the great crisis in the left, really, because we haven't seemed to be imaginative enough, we haven't come together, you know, to provide proper alternatives, you know, because what's actually amazing is, given this tremendous crisis, they still set the agenda. You know, suddenly this private debt has been turned into a massive public debt, and who's paying for it? You know, pensioners and workers and cutbacks, and you do not hear the other voice, and I think people in their guts feel this is very, very wrong.